Hi everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present at the Urban Forestry Days. Cecil and I have prepared a short and hopefully thought-provoking talk on how urban forestry is going global and the different pathways influencing this process. I will be giving the talk, which perhaps due to time zone differences, I'm based in Vancouver, will reach you in the form of a video. Well, Cecil will be there to answer your questions at the end of the talk and engage in what I hope will be an exciting discussion. We know that as the world continues to rapidly urbanize, the greatest sustainability challenges we're going to face this century will be urban. And urban challenges are not restricted really to the physical boundaries of cities, but reach far beyond. For example, our agricultural and industrial activities are having an impact on rural landscapes, and urbanization is increasingly having an effect on forested landscapes around the world. Of course, these challenges are also hitting cities, where we see issues of intensification of traffic and air pollution, intensification of overconsumption, and increased vulnerability due to things like poverty and inequality. We also see differentiated exposure and vulnerability to more frequent and extreme weather events linked to climate change, such as floods and wildfires. Now, the thing is, if cities are really the root cause of so many problems, they are certainly also part of the answer and the pathway to multiple solutions. This is really what motivated Cecil, myself, and a group of colleagues to embark in a research project some years ago, looking at the effect that cities may have on different sustainable development goals and the social, economic, as well as biophysical targets that we humans have committed to achieve within the next decade. To do this, we assess possible synergies and trade-offs between the Sustainable Development Goal 11, the urban SDG, and the other 16 SDGs. Most of you may be familiar with SDG 11, but just in case as a refresher, the goal of this SDG is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And it comprises 10 targets, which I have listed here. So we started first by looking at all the global efforts that were in place to monitor SDG 11 implementation, which included the SDG tracker of the United Nations, and looking at all of the voluntary national reviews that were submitted to the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And one of the things that we found in general is that there was a lack of consistency when it came down to data collection. So some targets were better tracked than others, for example. There was also no common methodological procedure that voluntary national reviews had to follow. We saw that each country used a different method and different template to complete the reviews, which made our systematic assessment quite challenging. We also looked at city-level global monitoring efforts, and here, of course, we run into a different challenge, and that is that different cities have different contexts and history, legacies that influence the way in which they are uptaking SDG 11 and the implications it can have on the other SDGs. So we decided to develop this framework that I'm showing you here that helped us better describe the urbanization process of cities considering different dimensions. First, the pace of the urbanization, if it's slow or fast over the last 2 decades, how urbanization is playing out in space, if we're seeing a densification of the urban core or a sprawl, and the level of affluence of a city, which can be low, medium, or high. And I am comparing here 2 cities using the framework. For example, Vancouver in Canada, that is showing fast growth, high level of affluence and a densifying core, versus Medellin in Colombia, which shows slow growth over the past decades, a low to medium affluence level, and sprawl. The idea of this framework was to give us enough contextual information to characterize cities and case studies that we use in the assessment to better understand how they are prioritizing different SDG 11 targets and the implication this can have for other SDGs. A key finding of this study is that overall there tended to be a bias towards certain targets, where both countries and cities tended to favor targets such as improving housing and basic services, increasing the efficiency of transport systems, improving air quality, and reducing waste, while other targets such as increasing safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces, as well as the protection of cultural and natural heritage in and around cities, were given less priority. The only targets that were highly prioritized and at the same time had an explicit role for urban nature, based on what we found, were targets aimed at managing disaster risk and increasing urban resilience. And this urban resilience, I believe, encompasses both social as well as ecological resilience. And here we can imagine different resilience pathways. Through urban forestry, we can maintain the basic resilience of a city, introducing practices that can help cope with current disturbances and increased climatic variability. But we can also be more proactive and embark on an adaptive resilience pathway, really thinking of future disturbances, novel disturbances that may be affecting the city, and how we can increase the adaptive capacity of the city through urban forestry to take advantage of these future changes. Or we can think of an even more transformative resilience pathway, where we are really creating the future we want to see, not only building capacity to face future challenges, but also increasing the synergies between SDG 11 and the other synergies, while at the same time minimizing trade-offs. Here I'm showing you a graph that we developed based on the assessment, showing some of the synergies and trade-offs between SDG 11 and the other SDGs through specific targets. The clusters to the right seem to be the most prioritized by cities and countries, with the lower one showing more trade-offs for forests and forest-based livelihoods, while the top one tended to show more synergies. The one to the left, however, I think is gaining attention in more recent years, and it certainly deserves more space within urban agendas in terms of how we can really find synergies around increasing green urban spaces to create opportunities for human health, well-being, and equality. A framework that is gaining global attention in recent years and bringing these synergies to the forefront is nature-based solutions, and the different pathways it envisages through which nature can address societal challenges and synergistically contribute to human well-being as well as biodiversity conservation. And I would say there is an invitation to take a step further and perhaps adopt nature-based thinking, which calls for a paradigm shift in the way we're currently relating to and valuing nature, and then designing the cities we want to see for tomorrow based on that renewed connection between people and nature. Now, you may argue that spreading these ideas to cities across the world is difficult, but what we found through the assessment is that there are already mechanisms in place that can be used as catalyzers of ideas among cities. And these mechanisms entail both international policy processes where intergovernmental organizations support the exchange of ideas and guidelines among cities, as well as city-to-city networks, which have created these peer support systems where cities can pilot new ideas and help each other be catalyzers of change. Recently, Cecil also launched the 330-300 rule, which can be used as a reference by cities around the world in terms of how they can promote urban forests and urban greening to support health and well-being more holistically. And of course, there is no better time to really think of these opportunities than now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is teaching us the important role nature is playing to maintain our social, our physical, and our mental health and well-being, particularly in the context of cities and in times of high uncertainty. I would like to leave you with some provocative thoughts from the perspective of our assessment and more recent work. First, to take a more holistic approach in the way cities are designed and planned. We notice, for example, with the assessment that cities tend to prioritize some targets and goals versus others, leaving behind some missed opportunities. And perhaps a way to take a more holistic approach is to integrate nature-based thinking in the way we reimagine cities with people-nature connections at the core. And the time to really adopt this thinking is now, because COVID-19 is providing an opportunity, an awakening call to strengthen our relationship with nature, particularly in the context of cities. In this regard, urban forestry is going to play a critical role this decade, not only to support the achievement of more synergies within the SDGs, but also to have impact both at the local scale as well as at the global scale. I hope some of these thoughts resonated with you, and perhaps you have some questions for Cecil to answer. If you have ideas or more comments, this is where you can find us. We're always eager to connect. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the event.
So our next speaker is Dagmar Haase. She's a professor in landscape ecology and urban ecology at the geography department at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And she's also a guest scientist at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig in Germany. Her core expertise is in modeling urban land use change and urban system dynamics and in urban telecouplings. Furthermore, Dagmar focuses on the quantification and assessment of ecosystem services and landscape functions using statistic and also Earth observation data. We can all look forward to your presentation, Dagmar, which is on aspects of climate change and its impacts on shape, diversity, and usage of urban forests in Europe. Please start your presentation, Dagmar.
Where do urban forests go? I entitled my presentation, and it's actually about the potential or already obvious changes climate change imposes to our urban trees and urban forests in Europe, something that we recently observe in a very tough manner, I would say. And this also frightened me a bit in the last years, and I would like to share this with you because I'm a big fan of tree-based, nature-based solutions, and as my colleagues in the wonderful Clearinghouse project too. But anyhow, we need to see the full picture. And the first aspect is the water bags here, these young trees in my hometown, which we haven't seen, let's say, before 2019 about. So it is the first time they appear, but now with an increasing frequency. And this is, let's say, typical tree distribution of street trees, Platanus, Fraxinus, Acer, Tilia. So this is what I would say for a Central European city, Northern Central European city. And the age distribution of these tree trees is, I would say, also very typical. So you see, except the yellow ones, so we have the big majority of old trees, 22% over 50 years or between 20 and 50 years. And only a smaller percentage of young trees that are replanted, as you see on the right-hand side. So this is, I would say, a typical picture, and many of you might find similar conditions in their cities. Well, but then for my hometown, Leipzig, 2017, it started, but 2018 became very apparent. These kind of pictures you see here, watering of young trees, what I have never seen in such frequency before. So we also saw in Berlin the police water cars that are normally for strong protests sometimes in use. So they were just used for watering trees. We saw it also in other cities. And you see just the soils here at this picture, extremely dry, and the soil monitoring of my second host, the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, regularly tells us that the deeper soils, they are still underserved with water, and the upper soils more or less fill up, but not to the level that the deeper soils get enough water. And this is really dangerous for street trees and for urban forests, not only for urban, but I focus here on the urban sphere. And there was something, I'm sorry, this is in German, but it was an NGO in my hometown, Leipzig, very prominent one. And this was the first time in 2018 I saw kind of an announcement, not only in the internet where this picture is from, but also in newspapers, in different types of newspapers, from the very, very conservative ones to the very left-wing ones. And they shared one message: please water your tree next to your home, next to your door. Just water them every second day. And this is also something very special, because normally these differently shaped newspapers, they hardly share any message together, the conservative and the left. But this was so affecting the entire city and the population and the governance, that they shared this message here. Well, this triggered us to run an own analysis last summer. You see here, we started to map the trees in spring and summer 2020. As Leipzig is also a case study in the Clearinghouse project, so there was a nice synergy effect. And you see here 3 groups of trees: the young trees, the average age trees, and the old trees on the x-axis. And the green is healthy, small damage yellow, medium affected is orange, and then heavily affected until death is red. And what you see here, the total number of trees we mapped, we have still relatively high number, a percentage of the young trees that are in good health, but some of them died after they were planted. You see this here in the reddish color, right? And then in the average trees, this is the best group. So we have a balance between those that are still healthy and those that are damaged, medium affected. And you see, the older the trees get, the more affected they are. I mean, it takes quite a time until an old tree is so heavily affected that it seems dying. And so far we have no reddish color. The young simply faster die. But you see, we have already a higher number of damaged trees than healthy trees. And you can imagine, for a big city, the old trees, they are really important landmarks. They are important points for every citizen, for every tourist, for every human being in a city. Without large old trees, I cannot imagine our cities. And we also did this taxa specific, as you see here. Quercus is really fighting with the drought, so already old quercus trees are just dying, and you see the balance between damaged and healthy is really, really bad. Also for Fraxinus, even more for Aesculus and Acer, even though Acer is handled as a hope species in Norway, maple, for instance, there's a lot of hope in it. So you see Platanus, the typical urban tree, if I can say so, for big parks, for long alleys, for castle parks, palace parks. Platanus is doing comparatively well, also the older ones. And also the typical tree for my hometown of Leipzig, Tahia, is just doing comparatively well. So you see, it's very much taxa specific, but they are all affected. Well, what about these conditions that produce that? Climate change matters, we all know that. And you see, Leipzig is situated somewhere here. We have about 8 hot trees over 30 degrees Celsius in the vegetation period between May and September. And then on the right-hand side, there is a forecast for 2036 to 2065, and a change of the number of these days we have today. And you see, we get a plus. Just this is Leipzig, the red dot. We get a plus of, again, 8 days of these hot climate conditions. So all in all, we have then more than 15 days that are extremely hot. And we have at the moment no such prediction for drought, but it will be even worse and even earlier, so that in April already these drought starts. We made very interesting first analysis using remote sensing data here, sentinel data, showing that the first blossom starts later compared to what we thought earlier, and then the kind of aging of vegetation starts end of July, August. So the vegetation period actually also changes in a way that needs a better observation. Yeah, where do the treescapes now go? You see our common species again here. And if I would say these climate changes occur that I showed in the previous slide, you can just, I would say, forget about these species. First of all, chestnut, that will disappear, that have no chance under these conditions. And even the grayish ones with average tolerance, a maple, English oak, European ash among them, they can be heavily affected. So it will be difficult for an urban tree manager to keep them in a good state. There are new species coming up, and here I will just click one slide further, showing you those species that we find in our parks in Berlin, Leipzig, and Halle since some years, where people are really asking, oh, what's that? What kind of tree is it? We don't know. I mean, in Leipzig, they just put little signs there where they just name the tree species, which is very helpful actually for citizens, that they just get to know how a ginkgo tree looks like, or an amber tree looks like, or a salcovy tree looks like, and the French marble, which we increasingly find also in our parks, not only along the streets. There's a lot of hope in these tree species. There are big experiments running, but of course, what we don't know actually, and what we discussed with colleagues from the big IDIF Institute in Leipzig for biodiversity, we don't know how our other species, insects and birds, first of all, how they can deal with the new tree stems, with the new tree species. Do they find their home, their nutrition, their places for nesting, and so on, also in these, for them, foreign trees, you can say so. Big questions for forestry researchers. And my last slide, or my last idea, focuses on what we actually have. And here I come back to Tahia's wonderful presentation. Adaptation plays a big role. Maybe we don't achieve the biophilic city within the next decade, but what we can do is we can take and we can use what is there, and this is brownfields, learning with and from nature. Brownfields are a wonderful nature-based solution, right? Because succession happens. This is just next to my home office where I'm now sitting, so I would just need to go out 5 minutes and then I would be there. And there is tree growth. My take-home messages, and I hope they are as provoking as the former ones. What is the future of our urban trees? Is this adaptation? Is this succession? And what about the hosted biodiversity? How can future tree and forest-based, nature-based solutions look like? What can we keep and what do we need to think newly? And the last point is, how can we govern future urban forests? How can we support classical planning using civil society, citizen science, and new forms of tree stewardship? I'm very positive about that and very optimistic. So this was my short introduction. Thank you very much. And now I hand over to Gesche again.
Thank you very much, Dagmar.
Thank you.
There are already some questions in the chat about tree species adaptivity. So we will ask them later. Now we will continue with the more clearinghouse inspired presentations by Dennis Roitsch and Vreese. They are both my my colleagues here at EFI, and they will present together on the topic Urban Forests for Society. Dennis is a junior researcher here at EFI Bonn and also a PhD candidate at the University of Bonn, and his work focuses on better understanding societal perceptions and governance arrangements in the context of urban forests as nature-based solution. And Rick is a senior expert in urban forestry and leads the urban forestry team here at EFI. He is also a visiting professor in landscape ecology at the Ghent University, and he coordinates the Horizon 2020 project Clearinghouse, which we've already been introduced to a bit, that looks into using urban forests and urban trees as nature-based solutions to improve livability, sustainability, and resilience of cities. Dear Dennis and Rick, you have the word.
Thank you, Kashi. Urban Forests for Societies, we kept it very brief and not as provoking as the other presenters did. And maybe we could just have only this slide, because of course all ecosystem services or benefits provided by urban trees and urban forests have a societal benefit. But in the coming 10 minutes, we will focus on the social aspects, or the ones which, or some of the ones which are listed at the right, in the right column. We start with social relations and social cohesion. Looking into service done with visitors of urban green space or urban forests, social cohesion is usually one of the most important aspects that people mention. It's so for stakeholders, visitors, it's very important, but if we look into the research, it's still quite under researched. Social relations overall include people meeting each other, sharing knowledge and values, participating in activities and creating bonds with each other, but also sharing but also exchanging, selling and buying goods and services in urban green areas. So also buying an ice cream on a sunny day is considered to be a part of social relations. An interesting study which was published last year by Chi Cheng and done in the Wang Guaxi Park in Chengdu was also looking into how important different people found these different aspects of social relations, and meeting each other and participating in activities was very important to the people visiting the Wang Guaxi Park in Chengdu. Although following a restructuring or redesigning of the park, it was very clear that there was a mismatch between the local use, the traditions, the values and the perceptions that the stakeholders have regarding this park, and the new design and new management approach. Of course, this is not meant to criticize the work done by the park managers, but it's not unique to this park. There's still a lot of missing knowledge with managers and designers on what people really want. So maybe a question for to look into is, how can we provide really what people want when it comes to urban green space? A second aspect is, of course, when we look into well-being and societal aspects of urban green space, is the health aspect. I won't go into deep depth here because tomorrow we have a full morning of very interesting presentations by people who know much more about this. But I'm approaching this from a societal perspective. So why should we focus on health aspects? And I will be showing you two graphs, which I find very interesting. The first one is the one you see here. And this graph is illustrating that, of course, the more green space you provide, the healthier people get. Well, Richard Mitchell and colleagues in 2008 have been looking into the mortality rate of quarters which have no green space up to quarters which have lots of green space. But the most interesting in this graph is for me the upper line, because this is illustrating how working with green space, how providing green space is impacting the most for people with low income. So people who have highest needs are most benefiting from more urban green space. And this kind of results was also confirmed last year by research on the use of antidepressant medication in the city of Leipzig. Once more, we go to Leipzig. And researchers have been correlating the distance or the availability of street trees within 100 meters of people's residence with the use of antibiotics. And well, for all people, the full population, there is a decrease, but once more, the decrease is highest for people with low social ecological status. So seeing this is a very clear and important message, I think, and definitely in these times after the pandemic, is that by providing urban green space, we are providing an unintentional medical intervention or a public health intervention to people who really are benefiting the most. And when you look into public health literature, it's quite clear that people with low socioeconomic status, they have the less access to health interventions, and they're also the most difficult group, if you like, to persuade to keep on with their treatments and so on. So by creating an urban green, by creating a green city, green quarters, we are giving the medicine of nature. We are giving a doses of nature without that the people who are benefiting are really aware of this. So this is the first very important finding here. And also, I'm not going into deep depth here. This is a monetary valuation of the Hallerbos, a very nice forest as you see with the bluebells. It's 20 kilometers or less than 20 kilometers from the Grand Place in Brussels. So very urban areas, very urbanized area. And a monetary valuation of this forest has shown that the direct avoided costs to the healthcare sector is about 3 million euros. And if you compare that to, for instance, the wood production is 10 times as low. And also other benefits like improved air and recreation also have, of course, a clear impact, although more indirect on the health of people. So that was a second aspect of why, from a societal perspective, we have to look into urban forests and urban trees. Unfortunately, what we all perceive, what we all know, is that the quarters which have the highest needs show usually the lowest number of trees and urban green space. So people at American Forests, for instance, have developed this tree equity score, which has nicely illustrate this divide between green areas and less green areas, and also correlate this to the economic status of average economic status of people living there. And without going into detail, of course, this is closely linked with the aspects of green gentrification. And by greening cities, which we are doing more and more, there is a high risk that we are pushing out the people who needs the green areas the most. So this is really something important to keep in mind. And one way of approaching this is not to green or not to focus the greening interventions to particular parts of the city, but to green everywhere in the city, or maybe even to focus to social areas, something that is done in the Urbinat Horizon 2020 project, where they look into greening social housing quarters. So up to here, I've been talking rather top down. I mean, what I've been explaining what we know from a science perspective, but what do people really want? What do the urban dwellers really want? And it's a bit difficult question to answer at this moment. Of course, there have been a lot of surveys, but the urban population is changing a lot. People, more people are coming in from rural countrysides, from the global south. Some cities are really getting more and more younger populations. Other cities see more and more elder populations and more single family populations or families with only one parent. Also, the trends are changing a lot. Well, we have the trend of forest bathing, for instance, or people willing to go out more and more, but also what I would call the Instagramization of being out and going out in nature. So, and this led us to a big challenge that we are at the moment developing within Clearinghouse, and Dennis is mastering this challenge, so he will introduce the work to us. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you, Rick, and also thank you everyone for tuning in this morning. I maybe first want to just mention that we are currently collecting the data, so I'm maybe not going to provide definite answers yet, but it is indeed true that we are investigating what people desire from urban forests. I wonder if you can still see my slide now, because I can see, yeah, there we go. Okay, thank you. Exactly. So we wanted to investigate what people desire from urban forests. And to do so, we've developed a societal survey. And I want to briefly indicate a little bit of an insight and outlook on the work that we've been doing. First of all, the purpose is to really use this to better understand the different societal demands. Rick mentioned the different societal groups. So basically understanding these towards the services that are provided by urban forests. Now, Rick, yeah, you already talked a lot about the social relations and the health benefits, but the work that we're doing with the survey is, of course, much broader, as we're covering all ecosystem services, also things like air quality regulation, water quality, or biodiversity protection. Our work is guided by these research questions. So first, how are urban forests perceived and valued in terms of the services they provide for society? Then second, how do environmental attitudes and basic human values influence perceptions of urban forests? And third, which forest do citizens find most attractive, and which forest do they believe offers the most services? So also this aesthetics component is going to play a role here. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I'm going to be brief because I think we're slowly running out of time. But on the survey design, I want to say that we've adopted a co-design approach in developing this questionnaire by working together with researchers across Europe, but also in China. And also the data that we now collect will be on the one hand in China, but also in Europe, specifically covering 33 countries, mostly within the, let's say, area of the European Union, but also beyond, like countries like Russia or Turkey are also part of the survey. It will now commence first with Germany and the UK, and then the other countries will follow throughout the rest of the month. Essentially, maybe just a brief word on the analysis. The analysis will focus on the data set in Europe and China respectively, but also as both questionnaires are almost identical, and as Clearinghouse is a joint Sino-European project, there's really a really good opportunity for cross-comparing between the two. What we'll have is 384 responses per country, making this a representative quantitative online survey and really a unique data set, I think. So we are all really excited now to start the data collection phase. Our partner with this work is a company called Bilendi, and I just want to say that the collaboration with them so far has worked really well. And maybe that's it on the outlook for the moment. And yeah, perhaps next time I can say a bit more about the results.
Now we have our final presentation for today. In between, I just wanted to briefly mention that we have 350 attendees here today, which is a really high number. I think it's the highest number that we ever had in webinars. So thank you all for joining. Our next presentation, it's the final presentation of this session, and it will be held by Michael Ramage on growing the future wood in buildings.
So thank you very much for joining today, and it's a pleasure to listen to all the presentations as well, and to be able to share some of the work that we do here in Cambridge at the Center for Natural Material Innovation on growing the future. And we look forward to a future where we cultivate our building materials rather than the past in which we extracted them from the planet. And I think one of the themes today that I'd like to focus on in terms of urban forests is how we can think of our buildings and change our use of them in concert with growing more trees in cities, but probably not cutting those trees down in the cities to build our buildings. But we do certainly look forward to a future where we're replacing buildings on the left, going up all around the world in concrete and steel, with buildings on the right made of timber, but equally substantial. And this is using materials that we've heard about today, cross-laminated timber, glue-laminated timber, materials from the forest that can be made at very, very large scale. So these are industrial materials like steel and concrete that can be used by architects, engineers, and builders with precision and increased productivity. So these buildings are built generally in one of two ways. In one way, they come flat packed, much like a piece of IKEA furniture. In the other, they can be delivered as modular buildings, fully constructed in the factory and delivered to site. And then increasingly, there's a third way in which elements such as kitchens and bathrooms are prefabricated volumetrically, whereas the rest of the building comes flat packed to site. Now, we're looking here at Mer Grove in London, which is the first tall timber apartment building built by Waugh Thistleton in the early 2000s. And one of the important things about this building is that it's the same scale as the home insurance building in 1885 in Chicago, which was the first steel framed skyscraper. And it was less than 50 years that we went from this building to the 381 meters of the Empire State Building in New York City. And with our current understanding and advancement in natural materials, we think we can probably do something similar in timber. So one of the projects we've worked on is River Beach Tower with Perkins and Will and Thornton Tomasetti in Chicago, which is an 80-story, 280-meter wooden tower on the Chicago River. It's a proposal at this stage, of course, but we've done architecture and engineering to ensure that it would stand up. But maybe even more important than how it stands up and what it looks like is how we might build it. Because timber is so much lighter than steel or concrete, we can think of ways to construct it volumetrically in a factory. And because this particular project is on a river, we can look to the derelict factories in the Midwest of the United States as construction sites where we can build this building in 2-story modules at ground level and then transport it by a barge to the building site in Chicago and construct it in the summer construction months from all these modules that have been made year-round, reigniting industries across the Midwest of the United States and elsewhere in the world. Because as it turns out, many of our urban brownfield development sites are connected to water because they are one of our main historic transportation routes, and we can reactivate them as a construction route for new buildings. And so sometime in the future, we think you may be enjoying this or another similar presentation from an apartment where the trees were grown not too far away. And for every tree that was cut down to build this building, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more were planted to replenish our forests. And of course, if we're going to build in a large scale in timber, either tall or many, we need to ensure that we have good stewardship for the people and the environment. So these are forest communities, forestry communities, these are builders, as well as the forests themselves. And my daughters like to ask me, or accuse me, I should say, of cutting down all the trees. And yes, we are cutting down the trees, but we're doing them in a way and we're ensuring that those forests can survive for our children and our grandchildren. And one of the ways to do that is to ensure that we have enough wood, and another is to ensure that we get the highest value out of our forest products. And cross-laminated timber, as you can see here, is one of those very high value forest products. So how much wood do we actually have? Well, it takes about 30 cubic meters at the moment to build a 100 square meter apartment in cross-laminated timber. We could probably make that more efficient over time. And so that amount of wood grows in a 40 by 40 meter square over 50 years, which is roughly the lifetime of a building as we design them. Or another way of thinking of that is that Canada has a sustainable harvest of about 220 million cubic meters every year. So over 70 years, that's 15 billion cubic meters, which is enough to house 1 billion people in perpetuity. Equally, the sustainable forests of Europe grow the amount for a 100 square meter house in about 7 seconds. So we've grown quite a few apartments in the time that you've been listening to me talk today. And of course, timber in blue, strength for weight is as strong as steel and stronger and stiffer than concrete. So it has excellent structural properties that we can make the most of. And one thing we need to ensure is that as we build our buildings in cities, that they have lower and lower embodied carbon. And so the building in the background is a case study of student housing here in Cambridge, England, 4-story building in timber, the construction of which emitted 126 ton equivalent of carbon dioxide. Had it been built in steel or in concrete, it would have 2.5 times as much embodied carbon dioxide. And if it had built in steel, it would have had almost 4 times as much carbon dioxide emitted. And this is before we take into account that every kilogram of timber holds 1.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide. And this is because nature's carbon capture and storage solution is much better than our technological ones, because nature only stores the carbon and it gives us the oxygen back to breathe. And so the stored carbon dioxide in this building of 300 cubic meters of timber is about 540 ton equivalent of CO2. And so one of the things that we need to ensure is that we give buildings, builders, developers, and countries ultimately credit for the timber stored in buildings. And the only way that this will become a viable carbon capture and storage system is if we can make this verifiable and long-term. Verifiable is easy because we know exactly how much wood goes into a building. Long-term means that we need to ensure that the timber stays in use even at the end of the life of the building. So this is part of a future circular economy. It is part of a stewardship of our buildings, understanding and remembering how to live in them in a way that lasts well into the future. And if we were to do this, just here in England alone, we need about 340,000 houses a year to meet our housing demand. And if we were to make them all in engineered timber, that would store about 9 million tons of carbon dioxide per year, which is a significant bite out of the UK's annual carbon emissions. And here in Cambridge, we can look around ourselves and we see buildings such as this hall at Sydney Sussex College that was built in 1596 and has been storing carbon ever since, and will likely be storing carbon for a very long time into the future. So with some of the strategies that we've already seen today on the circular bioeconomy and making sure that our buildings are valued, we can ensure that these storage is not just verifiable, but also very long term. And it encourages us to think about our buildings, how we develop them, how we live in them differently. This is a proposal we've done with PLP architects, Smith & Walworth engineers, and Provast developers in Rotterdam for a new timber tower along the riverfront that we think would be the type of building that would be both elegant and long-lasting, and a long-term urban store of carbon dioxide. So we can see a synergy arising between urban forests and the use of forest products in urban buildings. And so I think what I'd like to close with, in addition to a thank you to all my team members, is the idea that while wooden skyscrapers are possible and lots of fun to design and iconic buildings potentially, the buildings that we really need in cities around the world are from 3 to 10 stories, which is already being done, easy to do in engineered timber. And we need policies and incentives in place so that timber is seen as the primary urban material as a replacement for steel and concrete, and that cities and communities around the world can get credit for the carbon stored in those buildings. Thank you very much.
Now I would like to ask all the speakers of the session back into the room. I would like to start with a question to you, Michael, and then I'll continue with questions to the others. We have about 8 minutes left for question, which is better than nothing. So the first question to you, Michael, is what do you deem the most critical requirement, especially regarding the respective policies for increasing building with wood?
Thanks for the question. It's a really important one. I think there are 2 policies that I would like to see right up front. One is policies that would enable the carbon stored in buildings to count as a carbon credit. And this has to be done probably at a country scale because there's no value to an individual developer. The other policy that is much more generic that I would like to see, it's incredibly important for timber, but it's important for every building material, is to see sustainability credentials required for every building material. In timber, that would be forest stewardship certification or PEFC certification. I'd like to see the equivalent for steel and concrete and every other building material that we use, so that we can ensure that they are all as low impact on the environment as possible.
My next question goes to Dagmar, and it's coming from Lucas from the University of Sustainable Development in Eberswalde. And he's asking, when you talk about the species who do not have a chance in the coming years, are you then also talking about solitary trees, or could you shine a light on how planting trees solitary might be a factor also contributing to their death?
I would say I would refer to all the trees, including the solitary trees. I think there are definitely differences in the planting regimes and how they respond to drought. And I got also an interesting question from our team member from Clearinghouse, Jakob, saying, of course, there are also other reasons like pests, mostly following these unfavorable conditions of drought and partially also heat. But I would say this is also an interesting point. I only referred to the type of tree, the age of tree, and of this water deficiency in soils. But of course, in the next years, months, we need to care about other factors as well. Here, the planting regime, solitary trees, all these facts come together. And I would say after next summer, I can maybe tell you a bit more about that, but I would definitely refer to this, to solitary trees as well.
Thanks, Dagmar. There were also in the Q&A a couple of questions regarding recent studies, so maybe you can answer them directly after this session. My next question is from Barbara Oellerer, and it goes to Rick and Dennis. She would be interested in learning more about the issue you mentioned in the relation to the tree equity score, that by greening cities, there is a high risk of pushing out the people actually who need the green cities the most. What would you recommend here?
Yeah, my recommendation would be that maybe it's a bit naive, but that the city probably has to work on its full territory on greening instead of focusing on specific quarters. And yeah, also it depends a lot of the local context. If there are a lot of private housing, then the impact of greening in city on green gentrification is probably much higher than if you're working in quarters where there's a lot of housing owned by social housing companies or the authorities. So it's a very complex thing, of course, and we cannot probably not solve it from with urban forestry alone. So like, I think it was Dagmar who said it, and Tahia, we really need a holistic approach and a holistic urban planning. But yeah, things we see everywhere in Europe, also here in my home city, Ghent, is that the city wants to do something in this well, I do not like to use the word deprived quarters, but it's more or less what it is. And they buy land and they plant trees and they buy houses, demolish them and make a park. But you see the years after, the housing price is really even tripling, so or doubling. This is not good in the end.
Thanks, Rick. The final question goes to Cecil. There's no question in the chat, but I do have a question before we start with before we go into the next break. Cecil, you've been working in Vancouver for quite some time, and also Tahia was working or is working there still. Do you have a like specific thing that Vancouver is doing so great with regards to urban forests that you could recommend to other cities all over the world?
It's a good question, Geshe. Thanks very much. The answer would partly be no, because I think Vancouver is doing interesting work, but it's not exceptional in that way. But it's actually not true. There's one thing I think they've done which is really great. They have developed an urban forest climate adaptation strategy where they outline for the next 50 years or even further in the future what trees they should start planting based on a very detailed vulnerability assessment. So it links very nicely to Dagmar's work as well. And I think here we are a little bit naive that we're still planting the same trees in our cities today without thinking 50 years, 100 years from now, what's going to happen in terms of climate change. And we see some nice work in California where they develop what they call twin cities. So they see what city elsewhere in the US has the same climate that we will have probably in 50 years or 100 years from now. And what trees does that city have and how do the trees do? So we can start slowly shifting our tree population. So I think we need to do much more work like that in Europe as well.
Thanks, Cecil. That was, I think, inspiring for many people who listen to this webinar to think from a long-term perspective, which should always be the case in forestry. So we will go into a 15 minutes break now. We will reunite at 12 with a very interesting panel discussion with representatives of cities from all over the world. And we thank you very much to all the speakers of this session. Of course, it was really interesting and inspiring, and we look forward to seeing you again in around 15 minutes, around 12.
Thank you, Geshe, for the sharing.
Thank you, Geshe.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, thanks, Geshe.
Thank you.
Bye.